Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Hello, everyone. Tracy here. Welcome back to another episode. I am so thankful to have you joining me for another fantastic conversation. But before we dive right in, a quick word from this week's sponsor.
The season's just about to get underway. What have you been up to?
I'm not sitting around. Off-season's busy. Got a couple rookies to train up, some new systems to learn. But we'll be ready.
And what canola are you growing this year?
We chose BY7204LL, Brett Young's new Liberty Link canola hybrid. Our neighbor grew 7204 last year, said it's high yielding, it's got good standability, pod shatter tolerance, and strong defense against club root. It's a game changer.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, we have an amazing guest. We have Brian Reisinger joining us. Brian, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Good. I am so happy to have you. You guys, you are in for a treat. Right here behind me, in my hand right now, is one of the most amazing books I have ever read. Brian, this is brilliant. I know I emailed you and said, this is so good, but it is brilliant. Brilliant. Like literally, you go through, even myself as a farmer, you kind of think you know the history of farming, but your book, honestly, Brian, I'm going to say it this way. I think it is one of the most well-written pieces of writing I have ever read. Literally. It is so full of great information, like a history book, but then this beautiful and magical blend of your personal family story. So, wow.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I mean, for us, I didn't know this until I got into trying to answer the question of why our farms are disappearing. But for us, our family and what's been going on with these big, huge issues for more than a century now, it's all just intertwined. So that's how it came out is the best I can tell you, you know. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Okay, so after that very excited intro, you guys, Brian is obviously the author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, an amazing book. Brian, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background? I feel like I already know you, your parents, your great-grandparents, and everybody because of the book, but can you share a little bit more about you and the book, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm fourth generation, and our farm is in southern Wisconsin. It's called the Driftless area. So it's these big soaring hills and valleys, beautiful, very fertile, good work ground, but tough in the sense that it's hills and beautiful, you know. And we're just very lucky to have grown up there. I feel that way, and we go back four generations all the way to the early 1900s. So my grandpa, my great grandpa, I should say, came over here from war-torn Europe to find a better life, and he found it by digging his living out of the dirt. And then go on to my grandpa, who grew up in 2 decades of depression because the Great Depression was actually deeper and earlier for farm country. Go on to my parents, who got married just in time to survive the farm crisis, and then on to my sister and I, who grew up during the years of globalization, the years of the Great Recession and other economic downturns, as well as COVID. And so that's our family story. And as for me, you know, I'm a farmer's son. I grew up working with my dad from the time I could walk, but my talent, I guess, was less for cattle and crops and more for words. So I pursued a career writing off the farm. And I'm now involved helping out on the business side of the farm. And they throw me in a tractor on my day off because, you know, that's the blessing that farm kids have on their days off. And my dad and sister are working to carry our farm in through the fourth generation now.
Excellent. So I'm curious. I'm an entrepreneur, and I know behind every business, every piece of work, there's like a deep why. And that moment where you're like, I should write this. Can you tell us kind of if there's the moment or a series of moments and why you're like, this needs to be written?
Yeah. Well, the story is one that I've been carrying around with me ever since I understood the English language. I mentioned working with my dad from the start. as long as I can remember people, driving in the yard, they were talking about this farm got sold or this farm went under. I just grew up living with that, having the sense that I was very lucky to grow up on a farm, that there's a proud and strong and important agriculture industry on the North American continent, but also that it's changing and that farms are disappearing. And I've always had that sense. And as I grew up and as I pursued my career off the farm, I was in business journalism for a number of years. I worked in public policy, and it was around the time that I was really in the throes of my business journalism career that people were talking to me about, you know, they were talking about, the time between the recession after 9/11 and the recession of the Great Recession. And they were saying, you know, they were the good years this and the good years that. And I remember thinking, when the hell were the good years? You know what I mean? And I just remember thinking that and farming, you've got your ups and downs, and there were years my parents were able to put away a little bit of money, and then there were tougher years, but I had grown up experiencing that middle class living that they'd gotten for us, they'd secured for us, slipping away. And I just remember thinking, boy, there's people talking about the good years, and I realized I'd grown up in a rural economy that had been left behind by the urban economy. And that's when I thought, somebody's got to answer that question. So that question's been walking around with me since I was a kid working with my dad. And I decided I really had to answer it when I realized just how big of a disconnect there was between what was going on in the rural parts of our country and what was going on everywhere else. And the real tragedy of that is not only is there a hollowing out of rural America happening, but that affects the food prices, the security of our food, and the health of our food for every dinner table. And so that was kind of when I decided that, I needed to answer that question.
I love it. And I've heard you say that farms got left behind and it didn't need to be that way. And then you kind of
Yeah.
just walk through it and it's brilliant. And I really resonate with your writing. I've watched a few of your interviews by other podcasters and I really resonate because I feel I'm on that same mission as you. Yes, there's been hard times, lots of them, more than we even think of with our show really quick and how I feel we align. Um, we are dedicated to farm business management, and I help farmers get those ideas, those nuggets, so that they can be the best producer and obviously keep the farm going on. And you'll hear other people go, well, why is farming special? It's no more special than anything else, right? If they can't survive, then oh well. And I don't feel that way. And I think now more
Yeah.
than ever, we need to fight and give farmers the ideas and the information so that this way of life can continue on. And I enjoy
Yeah.
this way of life. You have. And it's not even just the way of life for me. I'm so passionate because, yeah, sure, fine. We all amalgamate into several big farms. The food's still created, but that lifestyle's gone. That
Yeah.
opportunity for the farmer to be their own business owner is gone. But I also really kind
Yeah.
of see it as a food independence. I mean, we're
Yeah.
already at the end of most production cycles owned by a few big players. If all the land is owned by big farms, well, to me, that's a bit of a food security and independence issue. So that's where I
Yeah.
feel I align and I feel I feel the feelings and the information and the mission behind your book.
You're so right. And I talk a lot with people who have a lot of sympathy for farmers. And, I appreciate the sentiment. But the problem with just sympathy is that there's other people who say, well, hey, what about this and what about that? And I hear them. I get what you're saying. There's small businesses of all kinds that struggle. There's all kinds of people in our economy that have difficult stories of hardship. I think the thing about farming is we have to understand that the people who are doing it, the farm families who are living it, they care about it not just because the dollar in their pocket, not just because they enjoy their work, but because it is that deep, deep way of life. It's when you lose a farm, it's also your home. It's not just your dad or mom's job growing up when you're a kid like me. It's your home, it's your community because you're not in town. You're surrounded by maybe you and other farmers or people who live nearby. You lose that, you lose all of that, and it's your heritage. And so it's so meaningful to a farm family, but also it's so meaningful to the country, and that gets at food security and so many other issues. I mean, who we are as Americans. And I think that there's a lot of this in Canada as well. There's a lot of this just in general, I think in the North American continent where there was this big landmass that was discovered and what can we do with it? And it became a huge part of who we all are. And the problem is if we lose all those farms and we keep, I mean, look, we've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for a century. Think about that, 45,000 a year for a century. That's 70% of our farms in the United States. And if we keep doing that, where does it end? And it is a massive food security issue. We're already seeing the food security issues. So the issue that we have is getting the food from the farm gate to the dinner table. It is such an integrated industry that, you know, the ability for our food supply chain to be disrupted is so huge. And so we saw this during COVID. We saw COVID strike and the supply chain locked up. If you have one big distribution center go down, you have one big processing plant down, if you have one great big farm, whatever it is, that can really affect the food supply. And during COVID, consumers of all kinds saw that. They couldn't get the food they needed in the grocery store, and if they could, the price was through the roof. And at the same time, the farmer was trying to sell their goods, couldn't sell their goods. If they could, the price was in the basement. And how do we have that? It's like a dystopian thing. And for anybody who thinks that COVID is the only time that happens, well, look, bird flu affecting the price of eggs and chicken, natural disasters, invasive pests, a huge conflict that keeps imports from coming into a country if they're depending on imports more than they should. This happens all the time. And so when you look at food prices and the fact that they've been rising far faster than the rate of inflation, it's because of that food security issue. So we're living it right now. We're feeling a system that is really a modern miracle. We're feeling that system shake. And if we let this continue, we are going to have deep, deep, deep food supply issues. And it's, by the time you realize something like that, it's much too late.
Yeah. What I really appreciate about your book, again, is how much history, and it's amazing how you made history that interesting. I love reading. I do love reading, but history can be hard to read, very hard. But it was this beautiful blend of easy to read history, how it applies to the farmer, and then you'd pop in your family and what they were going through. It was just magical when I was reading this. I'm like, this guy's brilliant. He has a gift. But one of the things that I like, the history here, we all thought it started with the Great Depression. And starting from the front of your book, you say, no, the problem started in the 20s with that financial crisis. And that was the highest numbers. Yeah. And here's the thing. I kind of thought like farm numbers would have been here. And then over the years, 20, 30, 40, the numbers were getting bigger. And then maybe they dropped over the last 20 years. That's not the case at all. Yeah. We started here and we've just been on a decline. Do you want to chat a little bit about that history?
Yeah, absolutely. So when my great grandparents came over here and tried to find a better life than they would have had, in a war-torn Europe, early 1900s, they got married and bought the farm in 1912, and that they spent the rest of their life trying to pay that farm off, right? And it was hard work, it was hardship, there was weather, there were brutal farm accidents, all kinds of things that happened. They had decades of debt to pay off. It was a hard life, but there was entrepreneurial opportunity at the time. There were more farms, and my great grandfather, Alice Reisinger, was looking around saying, people are finding a way to make it doing this. I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try it. And that's because we had a growing number of farms. We had emerging industries in agriculture. People were figuring out what niches made sense for different parts of the country. We had a bigger and bigger country to feed. There was more and more happening. That wasn't going to last forever because once the North American continent was settled, there's only so much land, right? So farms and ranches and logging operations, anybody who depends on the land, the great outdoors, there's going to be some consolidation because there's only so much of it and there's going to be competition, sure. But we ended up having in the 1920s, we really hit a wall with the growth of farms in this country in terms of number of farms. And then it never stopped. The decline never stopped. So what happened is, as you say, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, farm country was actually in a depression for 10 years before that. So after World War I, as men and women like my grandpa and great grandma were finding their niche and finding their way for their farm to make it. In Wisconsin, it was dairy farming. It was something else in all these other parts of the country. as these farms were growing in number and more of this was happening, World War One created the sense that, Europe had been decimated and America was going to have to feed the rest of the world. And so there was all this growth going on. And then after World War One, Europe recovered a little more quickly than expected. And so a lot of farmers that had gotten overextended, a lot of bankers that had got overextended, lending them money, all these things that had been built out in order to feed the rest of the world suddenly weren't quite as needed and the prices dropped
Yeah.
and they plummeted and it kicked off a rural financial crisis, kind of like we had in the Great Recession. We had a bank crisis where it went from bank to bank. We had that happen in rural America in the 1920s. People don't know that. It's lost to history because it was really only happening in rural America. So that's when our first farms started disappearing. That's the first time in the 1920s that we started going from more farms to fewer farms, farms increasing in value to farms decreasing in value. And all of these numbers went in the other direction. And as you say, you might have expected that to happen a little bit,
Yeah.
but think that we'd still be doing good for a while after that. We never recovered from it.
Mm.
In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there was a brief moment where there were more farms again in this country because there were so many people who couldn't find jobs in the city that they returned home to the country and started trying to make it. But a lot of those farms got wiped out. So there was a brief little blip where like there were more farms and then the Great Depression knocked the rest of those out. So we hit that wall in the 1920s. We started losing farms. We had a brief moment where farms kind of were trying to make a comeback. Then the Great Depression hit them even harder. We have never recovered since. We have lost farms every decade since for a century. And that's shocking because there were times that the economy was doing great in the 40s and 50s, in the 1990s. There are all these eras where the economy was doing good. And there were certain farmers who found that they were able to do better and climb in the middle class. My grandpa climbed in the middle class in the 1940s, but there were farms failing all around him. So even though there were good times and bad times and ups and downs for the American economy, the number of farms after that hit they took during those depression years never stopped going down. We have never addressed that trend. And for it to happen during good times and bad is really a tragedy that didn't need to occur.
And I'm sitting here reading and I'm floored because most of us don't even know this. And the research that you put in, and again, easy to read, but it's unbelievable when you even go over it. Like each time period, you talk about this war and then how it helped the farmer. And then the president came in and then did this, and there was big promises. And then because of the farmers being held hostage, then the farmers suffered, and then this started. I'm like, unbelievable. We wouldn't even know this history and how it's affected farms. It is clever. So
No.
you guys get the book, literally. You'll just love it. I'll say this a million times during the interview. It walks you through like every time period. And again, the beautiful blend of Brian's story in there and making it relevant to a family in Wisconsin, like literally the hardships and struggles. So when you go through this book, I know you mentioned there's four main areas that has affected farms: economic,
Yep.
social, political, technological. And those are the four areas that went hand in hand to farms getting left behind, cause
Yeah.
destruction, however you want to word it. Do you want to touch on each of those
Yeah.
quickly and share your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, I can do that briefly. So when you talk about weaving the story, I'll just note I appreciate so much that you're enjoying it. And what I'll say is we wanted to look at the hidden areas of history that have driven this disappearance and then weave that with my family story. And I have to admit some dumb luck. For me, it started with telling my family story. We had all these stories about people crippled in the fields and droughts the year my parents were married and all these issues, all these things my family had survived. I want to tell that story. And I thought, I want to know why it was so hard. Why were farms disappearing? And so I started to research it. So it's dumb luck for me that the things that my family was experiencing were emblematic of those bigger trends.
Mm.
But the bigger trends that we found as we dug into it, as you say, are the four categories, and I'll just get them really quick. Economic, we just gave an example of it. We There are economic crises that struck in this country and in the world that for one reason or another were not completely understood. During the Great Depression, we didn't understand how deep the problems were for farming and how uniquely they'd been hit because they'd been in a depression for decades earlier that a lot of rest of the country wasn't even aware of. In the 1950s, when there was good economic times, people didn't realize how much the farmer was becoming the little guy in that changing economy. The 1980s farm crisis was our own unique economic crisis just for rural America. Like every time there's like an economic up or down, we didn't realize how it was affecting farmers in a unique way. So that's the economic thing, because we lost more farms than we needed to every time something economically changed. Social was, some of these were just natural trends, right? Like people moving from rural America to urban America. Some of that was natural. Some of that was, pursuing greater opportunity, a natural shift in society. But it went so far that we had a lot of communities that were losing their vitality, losing people so much that they couldn't even continue onward. And it got, economically, it got way out of balance. It just went so much further than we ever would have realized. We crossed that line without realizing it. Political, there are times over and over throughout this history, often tied to economic crisis, when our political leaders have failed to see what's going on and have made the wrong choices. And in some cases, knowingly or unknowingly, have actually caused crises. The 1980s farm crisis is an example we could get into if we wanted to. And this is both parties in America, with the Republicans and the Democrats. The establishment of both parties have misunderstood the way that their policy decisions are uniquely affecting farmers and our food supply negatively. Fourth is technological. And although innovation is a proud part of agriculture in this country and across the world, and although it is a big part of the story, and there are a lot of people who are very resourceful and still working to innovate in agriculture, the overall innovation of the industry, the technological innovation, the change, the new discoveries have been slowing, and they've been leaving more and more and more farms behind. And that touches on a concept called scale neutral technology. Scale neutral means a farm of any size, large, medium, or small, could adopt this technology, and he would do what my dad would call penciling out. He's got to take the pencil from behind his ear, and he's got to be able to write on the back of a feed sack, if I buy this, 5 years, 10 years from now, the money that it saves me with the efficiency is going to pay for itself, kind of thing. And we lost sight of making sure that we have technology that's doing that for farms of all sizes. We had technology that more and more was pushing toward tilting things against the small and mid-sized family farm in favor of larger farms. And that's not even meant to take shots at the larger farms. They got to get bigger or get out. Those are the forces pushing them that way. But we had our technology leaving more farms away that were just as efficient, just as good, just as competitive, just as hardworking, didn't need to be left behind. So when you stack all those, economic, social, political, and technological, those issues played out over and over through the decades. And that's why when we saw that farm decline start in the Depression years, we never recovered from it, because we continued to make those basically mistakes in those four major categories for the rest of the next century.
Unbelievable. Some of the political ones really shocked me too. And hopefully I don't get my timelines dramatically wrong here, but correct me if I do. The 80s, was that when,
Yeah.
geez, I don't even want to quote it, where they said, okay, we're going to send exports and farmers scale up. So a
Yeah.
lot of the farmers took a lot of debt. Do you want to touch on that? Because that one floored me. And then that led to one of the biggest farm crises we've ever had, right?
That's absolutely right. The 1980s farm crisis is a perfect moment to take a look at if you really want to get frustrated about what happened to farmers. And you're right, it's political, and it's all these other forces all wrapped up, but really our government kicked it off, and it was both parties. So what happened is political leaders under both parties have been encouraging farms to get bigger or get out for a long time. They talked about it differently. Not all of them said that's what they wanted to do, but that's where it was heading. And that had manifested itself in the form of, in the 70s especially, the government encouraging farmers to take out more debt, sometimes government fueled debt, government programs making more debt possible, and pushing farmers to do that. And what we were doing is we were also doing big grain deals with the Soviet Union and others, where our country was saying, we need to produce all this stuff, and you guys got to take out debt to get bigger to be able to do this and keep up with feeding the world. So there's all this pushing going on. And within a few years of that, the federal government also began to increase interest rates, and they were doing that to tame inflation, just like we saw in the last couple of years. You increase the interest rate because that means that money costs a little bit more, costs more money to borrow money, to lend money. It slows things down a little bit, and it helps bring prices down, or helps slow the increase in prices. So they were trying to do that. And you could argue for or against all those decisions. You could argue in favor of or against government programs encouraging farmers to take out debt. Sometimes it might be appropriate, sometimes not. You could argue for or against what they're doing with interest rates. You could say, boy, they gotta get inflation under control. You can have those arguments, but when you have the government saying farmers take out more debt, and then saying we're going to make it more expensive, and when you have the federal government saying farmers sell as much grain as possible to the Soviet Union, and then suddenly saying farmers, we're shutting down exports to the Soviet Union because now we're upset with them. again, you can be for or against any of these decisions, but what you got is farmers taking out debt because the government told them, and then the debt being more expensive, and farmers selling abroad because the government told them, and then the government taking that market away. So there's whiplash going on. Farmers were the ones that were the casualties. They were caught in the middle, and it kicked off this rural financial crisis that was really a depression specifically for farms in rural communities. It was a depression all our own, and it persisted through much of the 1980s, and farms that had taken out debt were wiped out in the tens of thousands, unfortunately. My parents lived that. That's a good example where these forces mirrored things that were going on with my family. And, miraculously, it was such a near-death experience for our farm. My parents got married in 1976, and the first year it was a drought. We all joke, my mom still married my dad, even though she was a city girl and he was a farmer, and they got married during a year of drought. And they were trying to make it. They had crops that failed. They were short on feed for the animals, and they were saved by neighbors banding together. There were some older, more established farmers that let my dad. One old guy let my dad come and do what's called going halves, where my dad did the field work, and the old man and my dad split the crop in return for my dad doing the field work. Well, not only that, but the old man took less than his share, and he wouldn't take any money from my dad.
Yeah.
And that generosity, he told him, he's like, get out of here when my dad tried to come give him money. He's like, you just got married, take it and go. You don't owe me nothing. And it makes me just emotional thinking about it, what he did for my family. And that is what kept my parents from needing to take out debt that they otherwise might have needed to take out. They might have had to go into debt buying feed, or, spending money on feed for the cows and have to turn around and take out more debt to be able to plant for the next season. Who knows? But being able to get through that first year and stay on their feet kept them from taking out a whole bunch of debt. And if that hadn't happened, if they'd had to take out debt, they could have been wiped out like anybody else. And that's what happened to so many farms. And it was just that little bit of generosity from a neighbor and the hard work of neighbors banding together that kept us from being swept under it as well.
And that's what I think is so powerful about the book. It just literally hits the soul and the gut. I was reading that part actually that you were just talking about. I was reading that again last night. And I'm like, the weirdest part, and I think anybody that reads this book are going to appreciate their farming ancestors in a way they never did before. Because as I was reading what your family was going through, I was picturing my grandparents and then just putting my grandparents in the place of your relatives too, and going, wow, because you hear of the hard times, but in these pages, literally, you were talking about, I think it was your mom, after hand milking the cow because the power went out that same year as the drought, she was curled up crying. And, then I'm going, wow, some of the times our ancestors survived, right?
Yeah,
Just,
it is so true. I cannot imagine growing up on the farm as I did and seeing how hard of a way of life it can be.
yeah.
And then thinking about what my parents, my grandparents, and my great grandparents went through, it is just, it's mind-boggling. I mean, I think about my great grandpa, you know, fleeing World War One, getting here, traveling across an ocean. When he found our farm, it was the year of the Great Blue Norther, 1912. It's still the hardest winter on record, which is saying something in Wisconsin, and I know you guys know something about winters too. And the Great Blue Norther was a year where the temperatures changed and dropped so fast that they actually had winter tornadoes. And he journeyed up into the hills of southern Wisconsin looking for a farm in those conditions, and he bought a farm that was up in the hills, far away from everywhere else. And they would work through 3 feet of snow, and they didn't have snowplows in those days. I mean, it just blows my mind. And here's the thing that I've realized though, as I talk to farm families across the country, our farm, our family has survived remarkable things, but so many farm families have. This is what farm families do generation after generation. And if there's anything unique about my family, or maybe distinct about my family, it's that we were willing to tell our story, because so many farm families are doing the work and keeping their head down.
Yeah.
And I admire that so much, that resilience. And I feel grateful that my family was willing to tell their story. And I got to talk to all generations of my family except for my great grandparents who passed before I was born. And the brutal honesty and the raw honesty and the heartfelt emotion that they were willing to share with me, that's what's unique about us, because so many farm families survive this stuff. We just happen to be a farm family that decided to tell our story. Most of them are just getting the work done, you know?
Yeah. I've heard snippets of my ancestors, but my grandma didn't really like to talk about the past
Mm,
very much, probably for much of the reasons that were in here. It's pretty traumatic, right? For various reasons.
yeah,
Not
yeah,
only, I think when people read this book, will they have a greater appreciation because you just paint it. I mean, we know, okay, hard times, no technology. You can think about that and feel it, but when you walk us through in these pages, it's like we're living it. So I think coming out of here, we'll have a better understanding of history, a better understanding of our roots, an appreciation for everything we have right now. But the other thing I found after and during while I was reading it, pardon me, is I want to talk to my family that's still alive. I'm like, man,
yeah.
I need to get Brian to write my family's story and just put it to the backdrop of history, and just because each of our farm families, no matter who it was, went through their version of
Yeah,
this. No two ways about it,
they did.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's when you dive in and work to tell these stories about your family, there's good and bad. There's difficult things and there's amazing things. I write in the morning when farmers like my dad are up working. I get up at 4:30 in the morning. I kind of start writing when I know my dad is walking out the door in the morning. And there were a lot of tears alone in the morning when I was working on this, just because you sort through so much raw stuff, and I think about my grandpa Albert, the second generation, and he's the one who climbed out of poverty in the middle class. He was the kindest man I ever knew. He was someone who had accomplished something so incredible, like the generation that reaches the middle class, in the story of a family, that is just such a huge monumental thing to have done. But he grew up with the trauma of growing up in 2 decades of poverty and the harshness that comes with that. And as a result of that and other things, he had a drinking problem his entire life. And we talk about that in the book. And we decided as a family that we wanted to be honest about the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, because if you want people to care about, and I talked this about, my dad said it best, we want people to know the truth.
Yeah.
If you want people to care about these issues, they need to hear the real story. And if you want people to celebrate your triumphs, they have to hear your trials. And
Yeah.
so that's why we told those stories. And I think about my grandpa and what he carried around on his back, and how for him, what made that okay was, having a few too many drinks for a very long time. And he was processing that trauma. I think about my dad, who stepped up at the age of 8, because my grandpa slipped off a corn crib, fell 33 and broke his back. My dad at age 8 started doing the work of a man has never stopped. That's hard, but at the same time, there's beauty to it. I mean, any moment of the day, if he can be on the back of a tractor or next to an animal, that's where he wants to be. And at the same time, you talk to him about that time in his life where he had to step up, and it's incredibly difficult. So the hardship and the beauty when you're a farm family is all wound into one. And we just thought the best thing to do is to try to tell an honest story if we were going to try to shed light on these issues.
That's amazing. I'm so glad you touched on that, because when I was reading that and you started talking about him drinking, I'm like, oh, wow, that's gutsy and courageous that you included that. I'm like, that's great. Because, sometimes we want to hide that. Why? I mean, it's a common thing. And after some of the stuff they went through, who wouldn't want a little nip here and there to handle the trauma?
That's,
But, Brian, and
amen.
I'll give you some feedback. Had you not included that stuff, like the hardship and the human stuff, this wouldn't be half the book that it was, because that was the richness of it, the real of it. Because then I think of my grandfather and my grandparents who lost a baby in a house fire, right? One of
Yeah.
I'm not sure, that was a family of 12, and I can't remember where he was in the age of my aunts and uncles. He was my uncle, but he was just a little baby. They lost him in a house fire. Ooh, I'm almost going to get emotional. I don't talk about this. But then you think about some of those hardships. My grandpa tried to save him, couldn't save him. He wasn't, and the
Yeah.
neighbors will say this because they were there the whole time. Holy man, emotion. But they said he wasn't the same man after that. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I've had conversations. One thing I want to share, because that's the beauty in this, is the hardship. Some people will talk about how hard my grandparents could have been, like that generation, how they're not very emotional. I'm like, my goodness, do you, that man, that was not in his wheelhouse. That's our generation.
Yeah.
That man was
Yeah.
trying to build a farm and keep 14 people alive. His emotions didn't
Yeah.
matter, right?
Yeah.
And when
Yeah.
you put in the realness, the drinking, the hardship, that made it real.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing that about your family. I mean, you're absolutely right. That is the, I look back through the generations, and each generation in our family had it a little better.
Yeah.
Also felt the pressure to carry it forward and found it harder and harder to keep the farm going. So there's sort of an irony to that. But at the end of the day, each generation had it a little better because of what the generation before them did. And so, I think about my great grandpa. I mean, he was remembered as kind of a hard man. I mean, he was pretty stoic, pretty blunt, didn't have a lot to say, you know, wasn't the kind of guy who would come in and give you a hug and a kiss and tell you he loved you. Um, was very strict with my grandpa and his siblings, expected them to work, and like, I mean, just a really, really kind of a character that I think he probably contributed some to my grandpa's sense of trauma as he was climbing the middle class. I mean, he was a difficult man, but at the same time, boy, he left everything he knew behind to come across an ocean because rather than fight, in the trenches of Europe, he wanted to find a better life. He had 14 kids. He had, and similar to what you're saying with that fire, one of the stories we tell in the book is about my my grandpa's brother, so my great uncle. He was crippled in the fields, and my great grandpa was the one who felt responsible for that. He was whipping the horses, he was,
Um,
cutting the hay, and he didn't know that his, at the time, youngest son, 2-year-old boy, was in the fields, and the horse ran him over, and he had to carry his little boy, bloodied like a soldier on a battlefield to the house. And that was what he was trying to avoid. He was trying to get shed of bloodshed. He was trying to have a safe place to be able to raise a family and find a brighter future. And here's his son with a shattered leg, you know, and those do change people. And I just think about that and I think, man, look what he went through to be able to get us here. No wonder he didn't show a lot of emotion because he was trying to stand up and keep it from crushing him.
that's what I said to my family. I've thought back a little bit to those previous generations. This paints it in a whole new level of real to my family. And I've said he was doing the best he could to just actually survive and feed the family. We
Yeah.
can't we can't put today's standards on
Yeah.
generations of the past. So I think there's learning and there's healing and there's appreciation in this book. I want to ask you one more personal question. What is a highlight of this moment of this book, writing this book for you? And then I want to go quickly to Farms Got Left Behind and why, sum that up, and where you think farming is going. Typical female conversation. Let's go down the rabbit trail and emotional and then factual, but just there's so much beauty and information in here.
Yeah. You know, one of the most difficult, but also moments I'm most thankful for was when my dad and I talked about the mental health challenges that he has struggled with as our farmers struggled. And in the opening pages of the book, and then in some later pages of the book, we tell the story of us selling our cows. We're still farming. We're raising heifers for other dairy farms. We're raising beef for consumers. We're raising cash crops. But we had milked cows, our family, for more than 100 years, ever since great grandpa. And my dad saw that we either were going to have to get bigger, move to hundreds or thousands of cows at minimum, or we had to diversify and sell the herd. So we sold the dairy herd, and it was a way for us to try to find a path forward for the farm. But when you sell the dairy herd, when you sell those cows, it's like a death in the family. And so my dad was struggling with that. And there was a moment that I was starting the book with where I was writing that he and I were standing on the porch of my cabin and the sun was shining, but it felt like one of those moments where the rain comes just as the sun is shining because he was just bursting into tears and he was feeling a lot of darkness inside. And I remember wondering, because we'd grown up hearing about stories of farmer suicides, I remember wondering, is he thinking about that? And I couldn't even think about it. It was painful to even think about. Well, in the course of reporting and researching this book, talking to my dad, he shared with me that he had been. So here I had been standing on the porch sensing and fearing that he was thinking that way, looking at him and thinking, is he thinking about hurting himself? And he told me in the course of interviewing him for the book that he had been. And it was just like a weight falling from my chest all the way down. And I just felt so struck by that. And then what he told me immediately gave me hope because I asked him, what pulled you through that? And you ask that hoping that someone has pulled through it. And he said that what pulled him through it was his grandkids. At the time, it was my sister's kids. I have a little 8-month-old girl now, and we just had another baby born in our family. My sister just gave birth to a little boy. And so I'm an uncle 7 times over now. And he didn't have quite as many grandkids back when he told me about this, but he still had a pile of them. And he said that it was his grandkids that got him through it. He was thinking about, I got these grandkids here, I got to teach them things. He wanted to show them the farm, and that's what got him through it. And, I don't know if I'll ever have an experience like that with my dad again, realizing how close we were to possibly losing him and understanding what it was that gave him hope and the admiration I have for him to come through that, but also to share it. And we talked a lot about that was another one we talked about. Do we really want to share that? And he said, I think we got to. And he wanted people to know that, you know, you can feel that way and come through it. He wanted people to know that he wanted anyone else who felt that way to know that they weren't alone. And so, we decided there's strength, not shame, in speaking up. And I just going through that kind of an experience working on a book with my dad, I don't know that I'll ever have something like that happen again.
That's a deep moment. Wow. And people can relate, right? With the hard times that we go
Oh,
through, even at this day, there's a
yeah,
lot of pressure. And
yeah,
I do mental
yeah,
health episodes. Reading that, I'm like,
yeah.
for you for sharing
Well,
that.
look, I appreciate that, and people from all walks of life have mental health challenges, and that's why I hope that the book can appeal to people in a variety of ways because people from all walks of life have that, and with farm families, there's a certain type of pressure because you either have to keep going and fear that one year you're going to not be able to make ends meet, or sell the farm and lose everything else in the process, your home, your community, your heritage. So it's kind of like a completely, you know, unfathomable choice. And also it's each generation it builds. It's well, great grandpa survived war, grandpa survived depression, mom and dad survived the farm crisis. Why can't I make it? So there's a lot of pressure the farmers are under, and they tend to just get the work done and not speak up about it. But at the end of the day, it is the kind of challenge that people of any walk of life can deal with, and it just shows how important it is to try to talk about it and find ways forward.
Nice. I love it. Oh my goodness. I need a deep breath moment there before I pivot. So again, we navigate through the story of your family, the history of farming. A lot of mistakes were made. Farms got left behind. Farmers got left behind. You document that. Where do you think farming is going? And maybe a two-part, your hope with this book. What's the call to
Yeah.
action here?
Yeah. We have to find a way for the remaining farms to be able to secure new entrepreneurial opportunity that can bridge them into the future. So many types of farming that we do have been left behind in one way or another, where it's just getting harder and harder to do it. And the only way to keep making it is to get bigger and bigger. And we have to branch into new types of farming, new types of entrepreneurial opportunity. The reason I feel hope is because there are nearly 2 million farms left. And this surprises people. In America, 88% of those farms are small farms, 96% of them are family farms, whatever their size.
Yeah.
And what that means is you got nearly 2 million farm families that are still doing this, even though it's as hard as it is. And I just think, imagine if we could make it so that those farm families had new paths forward. They are willing and able to keep doing this, even though it's become this hard. Imagine what we could do if it was working, you know? And the way that so many of these farms are making it is that they're part-time income. You know, most of the farms that are full-time income are very rare. The ones that are there, the bulk of them are, you know, families that also have, you know, people working construction jobs or pulling factory shifts or pouring concrete, or, one of them works at a local health system down at the hospital. And then they're also, it's people working 2, 3 jobs to make it work. And the farm is supplemental income. What if those farms could be full-time income to our farm families again? And they could do that, supplying a new generation of domestic food supply to consumers, families who care more than ever about where their food is coming from. So if we can find new ways to create entrepreneurial opportunity for those farmers and new food sources for consumers along the way, we can help these 2 million farms work their way into a brighter future. And we can help an American public that is more concerned than ever about where their food comes from. This is true all over the world. There's more people thinking about this than ever.
Good and bad. It presents great
Yeah.
opportunity for us as farmers to innovate, right?
That's right.
And
That's
with
right.
all the technology and easy ways to market right to the customer, we have those opportunities to think out of the box and keep our family farms going, right?
Yep. That's absolutely right. It's absolutely right.
Oh, this has been beautiful. I am going to ask you if you have final thoughts for the readers that are going to buy this. But before I do that, I want to say to you, thank you for writing this. This, if you haven't been able to tell, it's impacted me deeply. But you know the thing, Brian, and I'm sure you realize this, I hope you do. You talk about your farm family's legacy and it's continuing on through your sister and maybe the grandkids. But this book that you wrote is a beautiful legacy to your family. Like, wow.
Thank you.
So I hope you
Thank you.
realize that. I really do.
Uh, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that. Having grown up loving where I come from and having found that my talents were elsewhere other than farming, I carried around a long time the question of whether I'd done right by my dad, and I tried to do that with this story. And I just hope that anybody who picks it up finds a way to spread the word on these issues. And I guess that's what I would say is the thing I want to leave people with is that it feels like this was inevitable. It feels like just farms were going to disappear for reasons we can't control. And there are some reasons in there that we can't control that were going to be the case no matter what. But we can do something about it. We can choose to care where our food comes from. We can choose to shift in the direction of supporting more of our farms locally and regionally. And we have to try to do something about it because we can't just let it go. This is a rural crisis that affects all of us wherever we live. And I guess that's what I hope people take away is that, we can do something about it. And I hope by shedding a little bit of light on that history and telling our family's story to help people understand what it's like on the ground, I hope that by doing that, we can inspire people to take a good hard look at this and see if we can do something about it.
Beautiful. Those are amazing words of wisdom to wrap up. If people want to get a copy of the book, where can they do so?
Yes, you can get Land Rich Cash Poor on Amazon or anywhere else you buy books online. You can also get it at bookstores all across the nation, all across the globe. And if they have it, get it there. If they don't have it, they can order it for you. And I've been so grateful. I know that we've had sales in Canada. I know we've had sales in many of our 50 states. We've had sales all overseas. And I'm just grateful that people have an interest in the story. And anybody who picks it up, I hope that they find meaning in it and maybe spread the word around.
Thank you, Brian. This has touched my soul and I appreciate this book so much. And I appreciate you coming on the show to share more about your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your kind words and thank for all you do to share these issues and highlight these things. I appreciate your work.
My pleasure. You guys in the audience, I was going to say, if you love this book as much as I do, but you are going to love it as much as I do because you're going to buy it right away. Like it, share it, get it out there, share this episode so everybody can see this episode, learn about Brian's work, and most importantly, find out about this book and buy it. So thank you, Brian. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.